Today, we are going to be talking about full color discharge printing. If you watched our previous videos on doing discharge printing, we had one that was a straight discharge on fabric. We showed you those ins and outs. We talked about the importance of proper cure. And then our most recent video in which we did a discharge as an underbase for plastisol, you've already learned a lot of the nuances of how to go about prepping your discharge for proper printing. All of that is going to be rounded out today by doing a relatively simple 3-color job with a multicolor discharge. We're going to do 2 different shades of green, and we're going to do a discharge white. And at the end, I've got an experiment. I know that what I'm going to do should work, but we're going to see how well it works or if I utterly fail. So when it comes to adding color to our discharge base, what is the best way to go about that? Well, each system, discharge base is part of a system. There are pigments that come along with that. In the Aquarius system, you're talking about pure pigments. And these are fantastic. They play nice with water-based inks. You're adding very small percentages, typically 3 to 6% by weight into your entire formula. And the only drawback to them is that they can dry out very quickly. It's just part of how that system works. So if you're using pure pigments, awesome. That's definitely a learned skill. For what we're going to do today, we're going to be using the fusion pigments. And these are more like color concentrates. So what's the difference between a color concentrate and a pure pigment? Color concentrate is something that's a little bit more user-friendly. In terms of the fusion pigments, they're about 1/3 pigment, and then the other 2/3 is, in our case, it's a clear core base. So if you're looking at the Green Galaxy mixing system, it's the HSA clear that we add our pigments into. So it's a high concentration dispersion. What this allows us to do is we can add 10 to 20% of the fusion pigments because the amount of pigment in there is not as high. If we're adding, say, 20%, we cut that by 1/3, and it's roughly 6 1/3% pigment. So max load for fusion pigments into any discharge base is about 20%. I like to be around 10 to 15. It's a nice, comfortable place to be. I've already mixed up 2 colors. One's a slightly dull green and one's a nice bright green. I use the formulas in our fusion mixing system. If you go to the website for the fusion mixing system, we have a beta option. And in that beta site, you can pick the Pantone coded colors. Now again, this is very much a beta site. Formulas are still a work in progress. Some of that pigment loading is a little off, but again, that pigment loading is for the fusion system, and you can go quite high for pigment loading in there. Still working with our ink supplier to fine-tune some of those. So if you want to use the coded colors, absolutely go there, check it out. If you feel that the color is off or needs an adjustment, send in a request. We would love to hear from you and get these formulas updated. Let's go through and mix up some colors with the fusion pigments into the Aquarius base and show you how it's done. So we're gonna add our discharge base, and then we slowly add the pigments, weighing them out to match the formula for the color that you're going to use. Remember not to exceed that 20% by weight. I know there's a little bit of math going on. Really easy to do. Here I'm adding about 40 grams of color to the 300 grams of base, which is going to give me roughly 11, maybe 12% head math of color to base, which is fantastic. We go ahead and mix this up. Now I mixed up more of the color than I'm going to need. So what I'm gonna do is I'm only going to pour down the amount of ink that I need to use for the job. In this case, because it's a video, I'm only gonna print maybe 7 shirts. Shh, we're printing hundreds, right? I'm only gonna print a few shirts. So I'm only gonna need about 100 grams. So I'm going to pour down 100 grams of the color and then add 5% activator to that ink. Now for the white's a little heavier, so volumetrically, I want about the same volume of ink. So I'm gonna weigh out about 150 grams. So again, I'm gonna add that 5% of activator. On 100 grams, you simply add 5 grams of activator. On 150 grams, we're adding 7.5 grams of activator. Give it a good stir, and then let it sit for 10, 15 minutes. You want that activator to fully dissolve into the discharge ink. So now that our inks are primed and ready to go, let's get on press and go through some of the basics that you will be experiencing when you're trying to register your first multicolor discharge job. It's always good to have your inks within easy reach for when you need to refresh. I also have a water bottle along with shop towels here to help out if I need to refresh my inks on screen and all the rest of that. Now, when you're registering a multicolor water-based or discharge job, it's harder to register with water-based inks in the screen because by the time you register the first screen to the last screen, that first screen, starts to dry up. It's advisable that for your first few times doing this, use plastisol. Just put a little bit of plastisol in your screen, pull the squeegee like you would for water-based ink, and then do your registration to that plastisol print. At least get your lining up that way. As you get more and more comfortable with the drying out process of the inks in the screen, you can start to move away from using plastisol in your screens to register to putting in your discharge inks. Now, of course, this is going to be a little different between the manual press and the auto press. Hopefully on your auto press, you've got a rig that'll help you lock in screens really quick, depending on the press you're using. And you can just drop in your inks and registration is going to be almost dialed. On a manual press, of course, we've got to physically line up each screen. So I went through that process. I printed ink on this shirt here, and I gave it a really good flash, lots of adhesive on this shirt, and now all my screens are lined up to it, and I can go ahead and add my inks. Now for our video, I'm gonna put in discharge inks and see how well I do. Can I succeed in keeping my inks wet and not get any dry in issues? Now, for those of you who are curious about what I'm using, of course, I'm on the Riley Hopkins 360 side clamp press. This is specifically with the rock arms. So we've got the 16 by 23 aluminum platens. Helps us to do really big prints. And I really like this press. So for the frames I'm using, these are our new premium red glue frames. These come in at very high tension levels. I am a major fan. I'm a big fan of tension in general, not stress, but mesh tension. I am using the Chromaline Hydro X Red Emulsion. I was talking with Kevin recently over at Chromaline, and he was talking about how this emulsion had been engineered for some of the newest levels of discharge and water-based resistance. So this emulsion itself is supposed to last far longer than previous editions of emulsions like this have been. I've been a big fan of Base Layer Complete. It does wonderful things for me. I've been using it for all of our water-based videos up until this point, but I wanted to give it a shot. So I'm gonna start using it moving forward with all of the water-based projects that we're doing, and we're gonna see how well it works. So far, I love it. It's giving me great detail. It coats really well. I'm digging it. I'm also using 65/90/65 squeegees, and we'll go over print stroke and best practices for that here in a little bit. Now, before I put the inks in, thank you, John McGee, Traveling Screen Printer, for this reminder on this tip. If you are putting ink in for the first time, give your screen a little spritz and just spread it around. You can use your hand or you can use a cloth. You want to hydrate your emulsion. Emulsion, as you've heard me talk about in the past, is a sponge. It's a terrible sponge, but it's still a sponge. So once you put your water-based ink in, it wants to soak up some of that. So prime it by adding just a little bit of water to your screen. When you add your activator to your ink, you're gonna see some bubbles happen over time. This is completely normal. It's part of the dissolving process. So when you pick it up, give it a good stir, pop it in your screen. All right, second verse, same as the first. Once you start working with more than one or two colors of discharge ink, or water-based ink in general, you are going to find that your movements start to increase. You start moving faster because over time you recognize how fast these inks are going to dry out, and you need to move faster in order to keep them moving and still wet. So you're probably gonna see me move a lot faster now. So how do you keep from panicking when you start moving faster, when you maybe start rushing? It's straight up experience. In the beginning, you're gonna panic a little bit. You're gonna go, oh crap, that ink's drying out. It's fine. Hydrate it. If you need to, clean your screens out. Trust me, it's gonna happen. You're gonna clean your screens out more often than you want. There are many times on a manual press, if you're doing a white base with high solids acrylic inks, white base and a couple of colors on top, where you're like, I need to not flood my white base and I need to spray it with water and wipe it because it's just, everything is getting unmanageable. And it's just the truth of the process when you're in a manual shop. You need that high humidity in order to keep things really flowing. A reptile fogger, ultrasonic humidifier is what a reptile fogger is, or just a naturally high level of humidity when you're printing in order to have the inks really flow the way you want. Now, when you're printing, you don't need a whole lot of pressure. You just need enough pressure to get your ink to clear the screen. Now I'm going to flash this for the sake of registration. There's no need for it other than that. When we're running, we're gonna be running this wet on wet. Registration's looking good. Bingo, bango, bongo. Fantastic. As always, when you're doing circle designs, be careful when you pull them off, otherwise they turn into eggs. I'm gonna now tape off my registration marks. When you put tape on the back of a screen with water base, because that emulsion is a sponge, that means that fluids can go pass through. It breathes a little bit. There'll be a little bit of a vapor barrier that creates where the moisture can go through the emulsion and create a little bit of a barrier between the emulsion and the tape. So over time, a couple of things can happen. The tape can actually end up moving. It can slide around and of course uncover your registration marks. The other one is you get this vapor with discharge in it and it starts to scoot out the edges of your tape. And over time you can see these weird lines that show up what feels like randomly. Well, it's the discharge actually scooting out from underneath the tape and showing up on the shirt. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go back and fix that discharge. You can't fix the removal of the shirt color there. In order to combat that, there's a couple of things you can do, and it really depends on your situation what's gonna work best for you. You can either clean out the screen and let the emulsion dry enough that you can put tape on the top of the screen. So that way, you know, it just creates a full barrier. Now, depending on your tape job, that's either going to work for you during the production run or it's not. The other thing is to learn how to register without registration marks and just not have them, or cover them completely before you even get on press. And the way to do that is to like cover them up with something like fingernail polish. It's just that acrylic fingernail polish. You cover them up and they're impervious to discharge and it lasts forever. None of them are perfect solutions, but we're looking for ways around that tape issue, vapor that can come through long-term or the movement of the tape. So my registration marks are 1 point. So down here at the bottom, I can see a little bit peeking out, which means it's like 1/4 of a point, which in the grand scheme of the things is nothing. This color actually discharged reasonably well. Slight tint to the white, but discharge white is never bright white. Now, when you're printing wet on wet with discharge ink, it's very important to understand that when you are exposing your screen, that emulsion needs to be as durable as possible, because you're gonna have this aggressive ink system, both on the squeegee side and on the t-shirt side. This screen is going to print wet on wet into 2 more screens. And that aggressive ink is going to be sitting there attacking the emulsion. So it's got aggression on both sides. So it's very, very important to, one, properly expose your screen the first time, let it dry, and then do a post-exposure whenever you're working with an aggressive ink. Water-based inks, discharge inks. You may be able to get away with a good single exposure, maybe an underexposure, and then a post-exposure, but it's not going to be consistent for you. You're gonna run into situations that the screen doesn't last. So doing it right the first time, I like best practices, it should be a goal, and it should be a goal for everyone, figuring out how to get there. All right, now we're not gonna flash it all for this. There's one stroke. Let's take a look at how that looks pretty good. Because I'm building up on the back of the screens, I'm going to do one more. Again, this is standard 158 mesh. This is not thin thread, although thin thread's amazing. And this ink is passing through like butter, which I would expect since it's water-based. Looking good. And we can see there just a little bit of the ink sticking to the back of the screen. That's normal during development of the ink on the back during your print process, ink transferring over. And on a manual press, these inks are gonna dry fairly quickly. So you can get some sticking going on. If you're on an auto, it's cycle, print, cycle, print. So that ink is gonna stay wet on the back of that screen better, longer. Just something to keep aware of as you're printing. If that screen starts to stick a little too much, you may need to pause and wipe the back of your screen. Just make sure not to touch the tape and move the tape. All right, let's run this through the dryer and see how it looks. Sulfur. You know you're cooking when there's sulfur. Looks like maybe my white can bump a little bit. And I think I overexposed just a little bit. I got a little bit of light wrap around the edge, so I've definitely got a little bit of a gap. So when your shirt comes out from the end of the dryer, your white is gonna have like a little bit of a crust on it. Giving it a little pop can help break some of that up, depending on how thick your ink deposit is. Your final proof is always gonna be in the wash because it's gonna get rid of this top layer, but you can see how it's in the shirt. It's part of the shirt. If you find during your production run that some areas start to close up, either refresh your ink so that it stays nice and liquid, or just give it a good couple of strokes. Now, I've got something that I wanna try. When you're discharging ink, what it does is it removes the shirt color. But what happens if you have something on that shirt that isn't dischargeable? You leave a mark there. One of the drawbacks to discharge printing is if there's like an oil stain on a shirt, or if there's a part of the shirt that had a stain on it for whatever reason. Usually it's an oil stain. You discharge it, run it through the dryer, and you only see it when the print comes out at the end of the dryer. You're like, oh, well, I've got to print another shirt. So in that vein, what happens if I print some ink? So I can either print a dark green or a contrasting color that will create a muddy green, a muddy dark color. I don't necessarily want to print black because black can be a little muddy. So I'm going to take this nebulous navy from the Green Galaxy line, put in just enough, see if this does what I think it will. Now I shouldn't need much down for this. Yep, can't barely even see it. So I'm going to set this. I don't necessarily want it to mix wet with the other inks, at least not at this stage of my understanding. So I'm gonna dry it so that it's set, and then I'm gonna print those other 3 colors on top of it. And we'll see if this experiment is a success or if it's an abject failure. Oh, we can see that my white screen is starting to dry out pretty good. So I need to be very cognizant of whether or not I need to give that a little spritz. Some high quality H2O. So I can see that color in here just a little bit. So let's run that through the dryer. No eggs. So this came out almost exactly the way I expected it to. I knew that the solid color on top of the navy color that we printed would end up tinting it a little bit. And it got to about the shade that I was expecting. Now that I've done this, I can expect about a 20% tint towards that color of what I was printing underneath. If I went with black, of course, this would be a little bit darker and it would be fine. My fear is that it would make the colors look a little bit too dull. Some of you are like, bro, why are you doing that? Why don't you just do another screen and make that color? You're right, if I'm doing a spot color like this one, that's absolutely true. I can just take that and make it a darker color. In this case, because it's going under two different colors, I would need to add two screens. One of the things that you can do with it is that you can introduce halftone textures. In this case, I've got wood bark and I've got a rainforest canopy. Not only did what I believed would worked, it worked to both a greater and lesser extent of what I wanted. So I'm not as happy with this tree bark look. For that one, I would definitely want to go with the black underlay. I need higher contrast for it to show up the way I want. But this one, with the rainforest canopy in the background, definitely hits closer to what I was expecting. Not only did we do really good spot color printing, 3 screens, wet on wet, great results, we incorporated a different element, something that you are not going to be able to get with your typical spot color printing. To be able to take these screens and turn them into what looks like 2 or 3 more screens, very tonal aspect of high detail, not easy to get with basic water-based screens. You deal with a lot of dry-in issues. It's much easier to manage that with just a single screen. Thank you all very much for watching. We appreciate you as always. If you like what you're seeing, hit that like button and subscribe. We really appreciate it. We're going to dive into some poster printing soon. So if anybody has some suggestions for us to, make the most out of what we're doing for posters, leave a comment below too. We'd love to learn from you guys who are regularly printing posters. We love higher detail stuff. We're going to be working with a lot of halftones and making some mistakes and learning from it. Love to see you guys join us for the ride. See you in the next one. Small egg. No more eggs. No more eggs. Although there's an egg shortage going on, so maybe that will increase. No, never mind. Never mind.